Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Shabbat. We are up to Perek Chavbet, Mishnah Aleph. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbaim, Neriyahu ben Burcha, Israelov, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen. The rabbis decreed that if a barrel of liquid such as wine, oil, or honey broke and its contents are going to waste on Shabbat, one may save only a limited amount. Chavit shenishbera matzilin hemena mazon shalosh seudot. If a barrel of food broke, we may save from it only enough food for the 3 Shabbat meals. Now, this ruling applies to a person who had not yet eaten any of the 3 Shabbat meals. If he had already eaten 1 meal or more, he may save only enough food for those that remain. Now, our Mishnah's laws resembles that of Mishnah in chapter 16, Mishnah 2, which states that when rescuing food from a burning house, one may save only enough for 3 meals, because if he were allowed to save everything, he might extinguish the fire in his panic to salvage as much as possible. The same concern here, the rabbis forbade the owner to save more than this quantity because they were concerned that if he rushes to obtain empty containers in which to collect the food, he might carry containers through a public domain. Now, the prohibition applies only when one uses several vessels to salvage the wine or food. If he uses just one, he may save as much as he wants in it, like we saw in like we spoke about it earlier in chapter 16, Mishnah 3, as the Rav says. Now, by limiting the amount he may save, the rabbis made it less likely that he will commit this transgression. Ve'omer la'acherim, bo ve'atzinu lachem. The rabbis ruled that he may also say to others, come and save some food for yourselves, meaning he may invite other people to save food from his broken barrel. However, even the people he invites may take no more than what each requires for the 3 Shabbat meals. Although one who does not own the food will be less concerned about saving it, the rabbis include him in the prohibition. Ubilvat shelo yispog, and the rabbis ruled that saving liquids for 3 meals is permitted only if one does not use a sponge to soak them up, because we know one may not use a sponge because one might squeeze the liquid out, which is prohibited on Shabbat. One may not even place a sponge over the wine so that the wine is automatically absorbed and then let the wine drip by itself from the sponge into a container. This is prohibited because he might squeeze a sponge, which is a form of threshing. Now, even if the sponge is a hard handle and therefore the person holding it is unlikely to squeeze out its contents, it is forbidden because the act of soaking up the liquid should not be done in the same way as it would be done during the week. And similarly, if the broken barrel contained a thick substance such as honey or oil, one may not scoop it up with his hands and then wipe his hands on the rim of a container so that the substance enters the container. Here too, the reason is that one should avoid doing a task in the way it is done on a weekday. Now, having mentioned squeezing liquids from a sponge, the Mishnah discusses squeezing juice from a fruit. And sochatin et haperot leotzi me'en mashkin. We may not squeeze fruits on Shabbat in order to extract juice from them, because that is a form of the melacha of threshing, which the commentators explain. One of the toladot of threshing is mifarek, extracting, meaning extracting something from a shell or other casing that covers it. This includes squeezing juice out of fruit. However, the biblical prohibition applies only to fruits that are usually squeezed for their juice, such as olives and grapes. In the case of fruits that are squeezed only occasionally, like berries and pomegranates, the prohibition is rabbinic. And in the case of fruits that are almost never used for this purpose, squeezing is permitted. Like the Gemara says on page 144b in Masechet Shabbat, the Mishnah refers to the middle group, fruits that are squeezed occasionally. Even if the juice came out of the fruit by itself on Shabbat, the rabbis decree that it's forbidden, meaning one may not drink it, because they were concerned that drinking the juice might lead one to squeeze the fruit in order to extract more juice. Now, the next Tana rules that drinking juice that oozed out by itself on Shabbat is permitted under certain circumstances. Rabbi Yehuda says, Im la'ochalin hayotze me'en mutar. If the fruit was intended as food, meaning the owner stored the fruit in order to eat it, that which drips out of it is permitted. But if the fruit was intended as a drink, meaning he stored it in order to squeeze it and drink as juice, that which drips out of it is prohibited. Now, although the rabbis were concerned that one might squeeze out more juice on Shabbat, that concern applies only where the owner originally intended to use the fruit for that purpose. If he intended to eat the fruit, however, he presumably wants the remaining juice to stay in the fruit, and there is little risk that he will extract more juice. According to the previous Tana, however, one may never drink juice that oozes out of a fruit on Shabbat, regardless of the fruit's intended purpose. Now, this dispute is limited to fruits that are occasionally squeezed for their juice, like pomegranates, berries. Regarding fruits that are usually squeezed, like grapes or olives, Reb Yehuda agrees that one may not drink juice that leaked out of them on Shabbat, even if one had intended to eat them, because since the common use of such fruits is for the juice, the owner will not be dismayed if the juice comes out, and he might well change his mind and decide not to eat them, but to squeeze out more juice. Likewise, in the case of fruits that are almost never squeezed, everyone agrees that one may drink the juice that leaked out of them. It would even be permissible to squeeze such fruits in the first place, like we stated before. And the Rav does say, "V'alachak Rabbi Yehuda," in that disagreement, the limited disagreement that regarding fruits that are occasionally squeezed for their juice, we follow, the Rav says, the Halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that if the fruit was intended as food, that which drips out is permitted, and if it was intended as drink, that which drips out is prohibited. Now, just as it is forbidden to drink juice that oozed out of fruit, so it is forbidden to eat honey that oozed out of a honeycomb. Now, actively extracting honey from a honeycomb on Shabbat is prohibited because of its similarity to threshing. To prevent this transgression, the rabbis banned eating honey that leaked by itself out of the honeycomb. The Mishnah cites a dispute as to whether this prohibition includes even honey that flows out of a honeycomb that was crushed before Shabbat. Chalot dvash sheriskan me'erev Shabbat. If one crushed honeycombs before Shabbat, v'yatzu me'atzman asurim, and honey flowed out by itself on Shabbat, the rabbis ruled that the honey is forbidden to be eaten on Shabbat because that might lead to actively extracting more honey. The Rabbi Eliezer matir, but the Rabbi Eliezer permits such honey because one is unlikely to extract more since the honey in a crushed honeycomb will come out by itself. People generally do not bother to extract it. The first Tana, however, prohibits even the honey of a crushed honeycomb because in his opinion the rabbis were concerned that if this honey is permitted, people might extract honey from honeycombs that are not crushed. Now this dispute applies to the juice of crushed fruits as well. Rabbi Eliezer permits the juice because the fruit is already crushed and more juice will come out by itself, while the first Tana forbids it because if such juice is permitted, people might extract juice from fruit that's not crushed. That's how the Gemara Masechet Shabbat, page 145b, explains it. And the Rav says, "V'alacha ki Rabbi Eliezer," the halacha does follow Rabbi Eliezer. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Bet now teaches halachot that pertain to cooking on Shabbat. Kol sheba b'chamin me'erev Shabbat, anything that was cooked in hot water before Shabbat, shurin oto b'chamin b'Shabbat, may be soaked in hot water on Shabbat. Even though soaking food in hot water is a form of cooking and is normally forbidden on Shabbat, in this case, where the food was already cooked, soaking is permitted. And the commentators explain this is an application of the known rule as en bishul achar bishul. There is no cooking after cooking, which means that once food has been cooked, there is no biblical prohibition against cooking it again. Now the rabbis, however, ruled that even cooked food may not be placed in a pot of hot water that is still on the fire. Our Mishnah, which permits soaking cooked food in hot water, means that one may place it in the pot after it has been removed from the fire. Now the rule of there is no cooking after cooking is limited to dry food. If a liquid or a moist solid was cooked and then cooled down, it's no longer considered to be cooked, and cooking it a second time is prohibited. Therefore, in the Mishnah's case, if the cooked food was a liquid or a moist solid and it had cooled down, one would not be allowed to soak in hot water on Shabbat, as Shulchan Aruch writes in Orach Chaim chapter 318, halacha 4. But anything that was not cooked in hot water before Shabbat, midichin oto b'chamin b'Shabbat, may only be rinsed in hot water on Shabbat, meaning one may pour hot water over it, but one may not soak it in hot water. Since this food is still uncooked, soaking it in hot water, which is a form of cooking, is forbidden. Nevertheless, one is allowed to pour hot water over it because that is not considered cooking. Now the commentaries explain the Mishnah permits pouring hot water onto uncooked food only if the water is poured from a kli sheni, meaning the pot in which the water was heated on the fire is called the kli rishon, the primary vessel, and the vessel into which the hot water is poured from the kli rishon is called the kli sheni. The rule is that a kli rishon can cook food even after it is removed from the fire, but a kli sheni can only warm up food and not cook it. Therefore, one may pour water from a kli sheni onto the uncooked food, because doing so does not render the food cooked. But pouring hot water from a kli rishon is forbidden, even though the water is no longer inside the kli rishon when it comes into contact with the food, because it still cooks the food to a limited extent. Furthermore, even though a kli sheni cannot cook, our Mishnah permits only pouring hot water onto the uncooked food from a kli sheni. It's forbidden to soak the food in hot water in a kli sheni, because although that's not called cooking, it has the appearance of cooking. So it emerges that the Mishnah's first case, which states that cooked food may be soaked, permits soaking it even in a kli rishon and certainly a kli sheni. The Mishnah's second case, however, which states that uncooked food may be rinsed, permits rinsing it only in the water of a kli sheni. In some cases, even rinsing is forbidden. Chutz min ha-maleach hayashan. The permission to rinse uncooked food in hot water applies to all foods except old salted fish, meaning fish that was salted at least a year before. V'dagim meluchim ktanim, and small salted fish. V'kulyas ispanin, and Spanish sole, which is a fish that has a very thin skin. Shadachatan zoi gamar melachtan, because their rinsing is the completion of their preparation, meaning in the case of these fish, merely rinsing them in hot water suffices to make them edible. Therefore, even rinsing is not allowed. One may not pour water even from a kli sheni onto these foods. And that is in the bottom of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen v'amen.